You know, when a pipe bursts in your house, the reaction is, well, it's pretty universal. You see a water pooling, ruining the floorboards, and you immediately grab a wrench to shut off the main valve. I mean, it's a sudden disruption, an obvious problem, and you instinctively move to solve it.
Right, because you see the damage and the immediate logical goal is to stop it. That is just the fundamental human response to a crisis,
Actually.
you know? Containment and repair.
Exactly. But imagine stepping into that same flooded room, and instead of seeing a disaster that needs fixing, you look at the rising water, the destruction of the room, and you think, finally, this is exactly what I need.
Which is a profoundly unsettling shift in perspective, to view the flood not as the crisis, but as the cure.
It really is. And, well, welcome to this deep dive. Today, our mission is to equip you, whether you're a parent, a teacher, or just an engaged community member, with comprehensive, actionable strategies for adolescent suicide prevention. We're extracting the most crucial insights from a foundational 1993 paper by Lillian M. published in the Educational Psychology Review. And to really understand this material, we have to start by completely changing how we look at that flooding room.
Yeah, we really do.
Okay, let's unpack this. The core argument Range makes right out of the gate is that adults approach adolescent suicide through an entirely flawed paradigm.
Right. The adult perspective looks at teen suicide as a terrible problem to solve. We want to grab the wrench, so to speak. But to truly understand the phenomenon, Range argues we have to temporarily abandon our own psychological framework.
We have to step into their shoes.
Exactly. We have to look at it from the viewpoint of a hopeless, despondent teenager. And from that specific vantage point, suicide isn't a problem at all. It is viewed as a solution.
Calling it a solution is, I mean, it's incredibly jarring to hear.
It is, yeah. It challenges our most basic survival instincts. But to a teen in intolerable psychological pain, suicide looks like a viable way out. It is perceived as this, soothing balm of nothingness, a peaceful escape from a life they feel is filled with interminable anguish.
So they aren't trying to create a disaster. They are desperately trying to anesthetize themselves.
Precisely. And if you don't grasp the mechanics of how they view this as a resolution to pain, your attempts to help are just going to miss the mark entirely.
Which is exactly why this matters to you, listening right now. Understanding this specific perspective, that you're dealing with someone who thinks they've found the answer to their pain, not a new problem, is the absolute shortcut to actually intervening effectively. It changes the entire dynamic of how you approach them.
It completely reframes the conversation.
So we need to look at who is most vulnerable here. And the paper starts with a broad statistical landscape, which presents some pretty sobering realities.
Yeah, the baseline numbers from the period of this research reflect a massive public health issue. We're looking at nearly 30,000 suicides a year across the general population.
Which breaks down to about 80 a day. And of those 80, 18 are teenagers. 18 adolescents every single day.
It's staggering.
The text also notes a sharp escalation, particularly among white males and Native Americans. And we also see a stark gender divide in the mechanics of these tragedies.
Right. Men use highly lethal means, like firearms, resulting in them completing suicide 5 times more often than women. However, women actually attempt suicide 1.5 to 3 times more often than men.
But, and I know this is a big but, if we connect this to the bigger picture, relying on these statistics is actually a dangerous trap for the rest of us.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, yeah, absolutely. Those statistics provide a macro-level snapshot for public health officials, but for individuals, it's a trap.
A trap in the sense that it creates a false sense of security, or maybe a false positive.
Both. Honestly, these numbers trick us into thinking we can predict behavior based on demographic checkboxes.
Right. So a teacher might hear that white males who use substances are statistically high risk and think, well, my student fits that demographic profile, so he's the one in immediate danger. Or conversely, my student doesn't fit that profile at all, so she must be perfectly safe.
You're trying to use a spreadsheet to predict a deeply internal crisis.
Exactly. You cannot predict an individual's breaking point simply because they map onto a statistical category.
Okay, so if we toss out the demographic profile, we have to look for something far more nuanced. We're talking about psychological red flags here. And according to Range, this goes much deeper than a teenager just seeming, withdrawn or sad.
Way deeper. We're looking at their individual psychological history, specifically searching for a profound sense of global helplessness.
Global helplessness. So it's not the localized frustration of, like, I am failing chemistry. It's the totalizing belief of, I am fundamentally broken and incapable of existing in this world. Yeah, it permeates their entire identity. There's no compartmentalization. And that global helplessness almost always pairs with another major red flag, which is cognitive rigidity.
Okay, I usually hear cognitive rigidity used in the context of someone being uncompromising in an argument.
Sure.
But here, it sounds like an algorithm caught in a binary loop-like. It loses the computational ability to generate third options when stressed.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it. It's a severe constriction of thought. A cognitively rigid teen thinks only in extreme absolute terms. Good or bad, success or total failure, life or death.
Wow.
Yeah. When they're placed under acute stress, they completely lose the psychological flexibility to generate alternative solutions. They develop severe tunnel vision. If they encounter a single profound problem, they view their entire existence as unfixable.
This brings up a detail from the text that honestly stopped me in my tracks. When we think of historical red flags for suicide, we immediately picture massive, undeniable tragedies. The death of a parent, a terminal diagnosis.
Right, the big things.
Exactly. But Range points out that a triggering loss can be something adults routinely dismiss, breaking up with a boyfriend. Or, and this is the one that really illustrates the point-losing first chair in the symphony.
Yeah.
To a functioning adult, that's just a disappointing bump in the road. You brush it off and practice harder.
But to a teen locked in that binary loop of cognitive rigidity combined with global helplessness, losing first chair isn't a bump in the road. It feels like the end of the world, because it is the end of their world as they've constructed it.
Because their whole identity was wrapped up in it.
Exactly. Their entire identity and worth might have been tethered to that singular achievement. We cannot project our acquired adult resilience onto their raw adolescent experience.
Which leads right into something else they process through a vastly different lens, which is the fundamental concept of death itself.
Right. A faulty or romanticized understanding of death is a massive historical red flag. Cognitive development regarding mortality actually happens in 3 distinct stages.
Okay, break those down for us.
Under the age of 7, children typically view death as sleep-like or temporary. They just don't conceptualize non-existence. Around age 10, they begin to understand death is real, but they externalize it. They see it as something that happens to the elderly or the sick, not themselves.
Right.
It isn't until about age 13 that adolescents intellectually understand death as final, personal, and biological.
Okay, let me challenge the mechanics of that for a second. If a 13-year-old possesses the intellectual capacity to understand that death is permanent and biological, why do they still attempt suicide at such alarming rates? I mean, if you know the act is irreversible, that knowledge alone should act as the ultimate deterrent.
You'd think so, right? But the contradiction there is explained by a powerful psychological phenomenon known as the personal fable.
The personal fable.
Yeah. The teenager intellectually understands that death is final for humanity in the abstract. However, they simultaneously possess this deep-seated, narcissistic adolescent belief that they are uniquely special and therefore somehow immune to the normal rules of harm.
Ah, the deep-seated conviction of, it won't actually happen to me.
Exactly. It manifests as an almost theatrical Romeo and Juliet attitude toward mortality. They might engage in incredibly reckless behavior, believing they'll suffer no permanent consequences.
Or they romanticize suicide as this ultimate poetic way to convey the depth of their emotional pain to others.
Right. Failing entirely to comprehend the absolute irreversible finality of the act for themselves, they're envisioning the reaction to their death without realizing they won't be there to experience it.
That's wow. Okay, so if demographic checkboxes are a trap, and intellectual maturity doesn't protect them because of this personal fable, the assessment process itself has to navigate an incredible psychological minefield.
It really does.
How do professionals actually measure a teen's risk without accidentally triggering the exact cognitive rigidity we are trying to avoid?
The assessment process is incredibly delicate, and historically, it has been fraught with unintended consequences. For a long time, the standard clinical tools were inventories like the Suicidal Behaviors Questionnaire, the SBQ, or the Children's Depression Inventory, the CDI.
Those sound pretty standard.
They are. These instruments are designed to meticulously measure past suicidal thoughts, the frequency of ideation, and the absolute depths of the patient's depression.
But range outlines a massive caveat with deploying those specific depression inventories, doesn't she?
She does. These traditional tools can induce what are known as reactive effects. Imagine taking a teenager who is currently hovering in a state of mild to moderate depression. You sit them in a clinical setting and require them to fill out a lengthy, detailed questionnaire focusing exclusively on exactly how sad, hopeless, and miserable they are.
Oh, man.
Yeah, the act of taking the test can actually leave them feeling significantly worse.
Because you're literally forcing them to dwell on the darkness, which chemically and psychologically entrenches that negative loop.
Exactly. You are asking a mind that is already struggling with cognitive rigidity to focus entirely on its own pain, which just reinforces the feeling of global helplessness.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because range introduces a brilliant pivot in how we handle assessment. It's an instrument called the Reasons for Living Inventory, or the RFL.
The RFL is a paradigm-shifting tool in this space. Instead of attempting to quantify how much a person wants to die, it employs a completely positive focus. It asks the individual to rate 48 potential reasons not to commit suicide should the thought ever occur.
Flipping the entire script. It's not about measuring the floodwaters. It's about checking the integrity of the dam.
I like that analogy.
What do these 48 reasons actually look like in practice?
The inventory measures cognitive deterrence across several distinct subscales. It evaluates survival and coping beliefs, meaning the deep-seated belief that I have the capacity to handle whatever life throws at me.
Yeah.
It measures responsibility to family, fear of social disapproval, and even moral or religious objections.
For you listening, the incredible takeaway here is that the goal of a psychological assessment isn't merely to put a numeric value on a teenager's sadness. The real objective is to map out exactly what anchors them to life.
Right.
If a clinician knows that a teen scores highly on responsibility to family, but abysmally low on coping beliefs, they have a specific architectural blueprint of that teen's psyche. You know exactly which tether needs to be strengthened.
You're identifying their specific suicide resistance muscles, and once you know which muscles exist, you can help the teenager actively flex and build them.
Identifying those tethers is the clinical side of the equation, but the actual friction happens on the front lines. Now that we understand how risk is assessed via these positive anchors, how do the people in the trenches, the teachers, the parents, the community members, how do you actively intervene when you suspect a crisis?
The foundational rule for anyone on the front lines involves how to process any talk of suicide. Range uses a profoundly effective analogy. You must treat all suicide talk from a teenager exactly like airport security personnel treat jokes about guns or bombs.
Ah, the airport gun joke rule.
Exactly. If you walk up to a TSA agent and make a flippant comment about having a weapon in your carry-on, security does not pause to ponder the nuance.
Definitely not.
They do not evaluate if you're just looking for attention, if you have a dark sense of humor, or if you're being emotionally manipulative. They take it 100% seriously every single time, and they initiate a protocol. Teachers and parents must apply that exact same zero-tolerance evaluation to suicide hints. You never dismiss it.
Let me ask the question that fundamentally terrifies every parent and educator facing this situation.
Okay.
If a teacher notices a student acting withdrawn, handing away prized possessions, and the teacher asks them directly, "Are you thinking about suicide?" Isn't there a massive risk of planting the idea in a vulnerable kid's head? Like, what if they weren't thinking about it and the adult just handed them the blueprint?
I want to address that with absolute certainty. No, that is a pervasive myth and a highly dangerous one. Asking a teenager directly about suicide does not provoke suicidal behavior.
Wait, really? It doesn't put the idea there?
No. In reality, the mechanism works in reverse. For a teen who is silently drowning in psychological pain, having an adult calmly and directly ask that question usually brings an immense wave of relief. The burden of carrying the secret is lifted, they finally feel visible.
And the text stresses the importance of the vocabulary used in that moment, right? No euphemisms.
You must use clear, grounded language. You ask calmly, "Are you thinking of hurting yourself?" Or, "Are you considering suicide?" You do not use softened, romanticized phrases like, "Are you planning on meeting your maker?" or "Are you going to end it all?"
Because realistic language strips away the Romeo and Juliet allure.
Exactly.
If an educator asks and the student answers yes, what are the immediate tactical steps?
First, break confidentiality immediately. This is the singular arena in education and parenting where you keep absolutely no secrets. You inform a counselor, the administration, and the parents.
Right.
Second, physical presence is mandatory. Never leave an actively suicidal teen alone. If you must step away, physically hand off responsibility to another adult. And third, actively intervene by forcing structure, specifically by making detailed plans for the weekend.
Because the weekend removes the forced structure of the school day, leaving a void where cognitive rigidity can take over.
The weekend is highly crisis-prone. You help them build a specific schedule for Saturday and Sunday, and crucially, you build a backup plan in case the first schedule falls through.
That structural intervention makes total sense. Moving from the classroom to the living room, the paper offers some fascinating guidelines specifically for parents. Beyond the obvious advice of taking threats seriously and avoiding reverse psychology, there's a compelling argument about how parents use praise.
Yes.
Range argues that parents need to actively praise routine accomplishments, not just exceptional, out-of-the-ordinary victories.
It counteracts a common parental fear. Many parents worry that if they praise a child for simply completing their baseline chores or finishing standard homework, they'll breed a culture of mediocrity.
I've definitely heard that concern.
But in terms of psychological resilience, success begets success. Consistently praising routine accomplishments builds a solid baseline of personal competence. It constructs that survival and coping belief tether we discussed in the RFL inventory.
Another piece of parental advice from the text really shifts the paradigm on how we model behavior. Parents need to intentionally share their own everyday failures and frustrations with their teenagers.
Now, there is a boundary to maintain here. You aren't treating your teenager as a confidant for deep adult trauma or financial panic. However, parents who relentlessly project a facade of absolute perfection are doing terrible damage to their children's coping mechanisms.
Because when the teenager inevitably fails at something like losing first chair in the symphony, they look at their seemingly flawless parents and conclude that their own failure is unique, isolating, and unfixable.
Exactly. By sharing everyday frustrations and, crucially, sharing the process of navigating them, parents model what psychologists call problem-focused coping.
Can you break down the mechanics of problem-focused coping versus emotion-focused coping?
Sure. Emotion-focused coping occurs when a person attempts to manage or modify the disturbing emotional distress caused by a stressor rather than addressing the stressor itself.
Like what?
It looks like venting, retreating into denial, or sheer passivity. You're just trying to numb the bad feeling in the moment. Adolescents who attempt suicide almost exclusively rely on emotion-focused coping. Problem-focused coping, conversely, involves actively analyzing the stressor, seeking tangible support, and taking systematic steps to dismantle or change the problem.
So, a parent coming home and saying, I completely botched a presentation at work today. I felt awful about it, so here is the step-by-step plan I wrote out to address the fallout tomorrow. That parent is literally providing a live-action tutorial on how to survive a crisis without resorting to a permanent destructive solution.
They are proving, through lived example, that negative emotions are temporary and survivable, and that complex problems can be deconstructed.
Modeling that problem-solving works at home is vital, but that individual resilience immediately gets tested the second a teen walks into the high-pressure ecosystem of a high school. How does an administration protect that vulnerability at a macro level, especially regarding prevention and managing the aftermath of a tragedy?
On the prevention side, schools can implement systemic support like hotlines. The data shows women tend to utilize these more frequently and find them beneficial, although they require significant funding to maintain.
Sure.
More effectively, schools can deploy training modules that teach the student body how to identify suicidal cues in their peers, recognizing that a teenager is far more likely to confess their pain to a friend than to a teacher.
But administrators operate under the constant fear of behavioral contagion, don't they? The very real phenomenon where one suicide triggers a cluster of copycat attempts.
The mechanics of contagion are terrifying. But what's fascinating here is how administrators can actually hijack those exact mechanics for a positive outcome. Range refers to this as the Betty Ford approach.
Referring to the former First Lady's public health advocacy.
Exactly. When Betty Ford publicly and transparently discussed her battle with breast cancer, the nation saw a massive, statistically significant surge in women seeking out preventative screenings. She modeled a positive, life-saving behavior, and the public emulated it.
Oh.
Schools can harness this same social dynamic. Instead of inadvertently romanticizing a tragedy, administrators can invite popular peers, local athletes, or respected figures to publicly share how they hit a breaking point and successfully sought therapy, or went to rehab, or asked for help.
You take the viral nature of high school social dynamics and use it to make the adaptive response to stress contagious. You make seeking help the cool, modern behavior.
You're providing a script for survival that vulnerable teens can copy.
But despite all our best efforts with modeling and prevention, sometimes the dam breaks, the worst happens. And that introduces the concept of postvention. What are the mechanics of a postvention strategy?
Postvention is the highly structured, specific protocol deployed by a school and community immediately after a suicide has occurred.
Right.
Its primary objectives are to halt contagion, minimize the inevitable scapegoating, and alleviate the crushing, toxic survivor guilt that paralyzes parents, teachers, and peers.
That intense survivor guilt is deeply intertwined with a psychological mechanism called the hindsight bias. The text highlights this brilliantly with the Genie study. How did the researchers prove that our brains essentially trick us into feeling guilty after a tragedy?
The methodology of the Genie study perfectly isolates how our minds torture us retroactively. Researchers took a group of subjects and presented them with a case study about a troubled 13-year-old girl named Jeannie.
Right.
They detailed a litany of severe stressors in her life: extreme poverty, intense conflict at home, and escalating trouble at school.
And how did they manipulate the information to reveal the bias?
They split the subjects. They asked the first group, who only knew about Jeannie's difficult life circumstances, "Based on these facts, would you expect Jeannie to commit suicide?"
Let me guess, they said no.
The overwhelming consensus was no. They recognized she was struggling, but didn't predict lethal self-harm. However, they presented the exact same background information to the second group, but added one final fact: Jeannie did commit suicide.
Wow.
Then they asked the second group, would you have expected Jeannie to commit suicide?
Armed with the ending, the second group's answer completely changed.
Dramatically. Once the second group knew the tragic outcome, they looked backward at the exact same data points and decided the suicide was entirely obvious and inevitable. That cognitive distortion is hindsight bias.
It's the brain screaming, "I should have known! The signs were slashing right in front of me!"
But the signs weren't obvious to the control group. Postvention protocols rely on constantly communicating to the grieving community that individual suicide is, in the present moment, impossible to predict with certainty.
Right.
Retrospective guilt serves absolutely no adaptive purpose. Left unchecked, it simply mutates into a desperate need to find a scapegoat, blaming the parents for being oblivious, the school for being negligent, or a peer for a final argument.
And the other critical pillar of postvention is stopping the copycat effect dead in its tracks.
To halt contagion, postvention guidelines dictate a strict narrative control. The suicide must never, under any circumstances, be portrayed as a romantic tragedy, a heroic release, or an understandable response to a stressful curriculum.
How should it be framed?
It must be firmly and consistently framed as a deviant act committed by a profoundly disturbed individual. That harsh framing deliberately strips away the Romeo and Juliet allure for any vulnerable teens watching the aftermath.
So what does this all mean for us? We've navigated an incredibly dense and vital landscape today. We started by radically shifting our perspective, recognizing that a suicidal adolescent doesn't see death as a problem to be solved, but as a desperately sought solution to intolerable psychological pain.
Yeah, that paradigm shift is everything.
We unpacked why relying on demographic statistics is a dangerous trap, and why we must instead hunt for deep psychological red flags like global helplessness and cognitive rigidity, states of mind that can be triggered by losses adults might easily dismiss, like losing a spot in the band.
Right.
We explored how clinical tools like the Reasons for Living inventory pivot away from just measuring the depth of the floodwaters, focusing instead on identifying the positive tethers and coping beliefs we can actively reinforce.
Which is so crucial.
And we broke down the tactical interventions for the front lines, treating every hint with the zero tolerance of an airport security checkpoint, breaking confidentiality immediately, and actively modeling problem-focused coping at home, all while schools work to harness positive contagion through the Betty Ford approach and deploy postvention strategies to combat hindsight bias.
It is a profound amount of information, but it fundamentally funnels down to one core belief. Critical thinking and applied knowledge are our strongest defenses. Understanding these psychological mechanisms is incredibly valuable, but only if we possess the courage to execute them in real time.
Absolutely.
It takes genuine bravery to look a teenager in the eye, bypass the euphemisms, and ask the hard, direct questions about suicide. But as the research proves, that directness doesn't plant a seed of destruction, it throws a necessary lifeline into the flood.
And that brings us to a final thought for you to carry forward. The text places a massive structural emphasis on how parents and communities can build suicide resistance. Specifically, by praising routine accomplishments to build baseline competence, and by transparently sharing our own failures to teach step-by-step, problem-focused coping.
Yeah.
It forces a difficult reflection. In our modern hyper-competitive culture, a culture that increasingly only rewards absolute measurable exceptionalism and constantly projects curated, flawless perfection on every screen, how might we be inadvertently stripping a generation of teenagers of the exact coping mechanisms and cognitive deterrence they need to survive the flood? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time.